our next speaker is Michelle Barker, coming all the way from the UK. And it is my duty to help her find any drummers in the audience. She's been trying to find drummers, but she has not. If you are a drummer, please approach her. And yeah, she will be talking about creative CSS. Please give it up for Michelle Barker.
So, hi, thank you. Today we're going to be talking about creative CSS layout. So, some of the features that we currently have at our disposal, some that are coming soon in 2022 and beyond, and some creative ways you can use them to build layouts suitable for an era where how we browse the web is more flexible than ever. So a few things about me. I'm a front-end developer at a company called Ada Mode, a data science and AI company working in the renewable energy sector. And my current work focuses on building a web app for wind turbine operators. So as a big fan of windmills, I'm very happy to be here in the Netherlands today. I also write quite a lot about CSS. So I write for various publications like Smashing Magazine, CSS Tricks, Code Drops. And I think of myself as a kind of CSS tinkerer and creative coder. I spend a lot of my time just messing about with CSS and new CSS features. And I write a lot about it on my blog, CSS in Real Life, which some of you might have come across. And as Hui Jing mentioned, I am from the UK. Sorry, another UK speaker. But I do come armed with a couple of very important Dutch phrases, which I'll practice for you. So these are very important for a British person. Wil je een kopje thee? And ik wil een kopje thee. And and if you don't know what those mean, just ask your nearest Dutch-speaking neighbor, and then you'll make a new friend as well. So right now is a super exciting time for CSS, as we've already seen. Like, there's so many new exciting CSS features just coming out, and we're seeing them landing in browsers. We've seen some amazing talks over the past day or so, getting me even more excited to build some creative stuff. But I also take quite a pragmatic approach when I'm writing CSS too. So I'm from a web agency background. I know that, while CSS might be moving along at a blazing pace right now, it's not always easy for the average developer to keep up. And even if you do know all about the latest and greatest CSS features, there might be a few reasons why it's not always practical to use them straight away. So you perhaps need to consider browser support. Maybe lots of your clients are using older browsers, and you need to, factor in the time that it takes to support new features and, provide sensible fallbacks. Or you might be part of a mixed ability team. So in my previous agency role, I was working with a lot of WordPress developers who needed to be able to support and maintain the projects I was working on, and to be able to jump in and write CSS when needed, despite not being experts in CSS themselves. So I had to be a bit mindful of that with the code I was writing. Or maybe you're struggling to keep up with all the amazing new advancements in CSS, and you're not quite sure which is the right layout technique to use in a given situation. So this is where hopefully this presentation will help you a little bit. So we're going to address how some of the CSS layout features that we have right now can help us build creative layouts and solve some common UI challenges, and look at how the next generation of CSS features can help us build even more creative layouts. Now, it's pretty incredible to think that up until Flexbox, which came out in, I think, 2012, we didn't really have any kind of layout method that was intrinsic to the web. We sort of hacked around with tables and then floats, but we didn't really have anything that felt like it was built for the web. And then Flexbox, was a big game changer. Suddenly we could put items next to each other in a sensible way without doing all these kind of crazy clear fixes and things. And then since then, there's been a kind of Cambrian explosion of CSS layout features. So, we've had multi-column and viewport units. We've had logical properties and writing modes, which, not exclusive to layout, but they, help us a lot, and provide us with other kind of layout tools and features. And then, we had grid and custom properties, which dropped at the same time. And for me, grid was a huge game changer. So I come from a design background. And, when I first saw grid and first started playing around with it, that felt to me like, the way we should be doing layout on the web. Just everything felt like it was clicking into place. It comes down to, a little bit of what Jeremy was talking about yesterday about, material honesty, and, grid felt like it was something that was for the web. So that was super exciting to me. And pretty soon we have even more exciting CSS features that will help us with our layouts. So we have container queries coming, as I think it was Rachel mentioned briefly yesterday. So something that developers have been asking for a really long time. And we have subgrid, and we have the has, pseudo-class, or parent selector, which again, it's not exclusive to CSS layout, but there are some pretty interesting ways that we could perhaps use it. And I'm sure some more and more creative use cases will be uncovered. And what a lot of these features have in common is they enable us to embrace a more flexible web where we accept the unknowability of the user's browsing context. So Jen Simmons refers to intrinsic web design to describe the new era of CSS layout beyond responsive design, where we're using the web as a medium in its own right, rather than trying to emulate print design, where the focus is on being fluid and adaptable, responding to content and context, while still being able to be really creative with our layouts too. And with our current set of CSS features, we can build most layouts now, but the challenge is knowing which tool to pick for the job at hand. And a common question I hear a lot is, should I use flexbox or grid for a layout? And a lot of the time, the answer is either or both. So when grid was released, I feel like a lot of people assumed it would replace flexbox. And it's true, it replaces flexbox in some situations, because before grid came along, we were building layouts in flexbox that weren't perhaps necessarily well suited to it. And even now I see people asking which is better, grid or flexbox. But it's not a competition. They're both perfectly valid tools in your CSS layout toolbox. And they have different but overlapping use cases, as we'll see. So some layouts are clearly better built with one or the other. But other layouts could conceivably be built with either or both. So you might have a component where the outer layer is built with grid, something inside it is built with flexbox, or vice versa. And there's no right or wrong, as long as it works. And their uses actually overlap quite a bit. So grid is generally a better choice for two-dimensional layouts. Flexbox only permits us to lay out items on a single dimension. But grid can do one-dimensional layout too. So don't fall into the trap of thinking just because a component you're building has a single dimension that you can't use grid, because of course you can. And I've also heard it said grid is better for page layout, flexbox is better for components. But again, that's not really true. For many, many components, grid would be a better choice. And now Flexbox has gap support, so the line is perhaps even more blurred. And you might think, looking at this diagram, that actually you should be using grid way more than Flexbox, because I think quite a few more items fall into that sort of grid half of the diagram. But actually, I probably use Flexbox way more. So you could build a button like this in grid or in Flexbox, and the result would be more or less the same. But the only difference would be, if you had a really small space, a really small viewport, and that you wanted that icon to maybe wrap onto the next line. With Flexbox, that's handled pretty nicely if you've got Flex Wrap on there, and you don't need to do a lot else. Whereas with grid, you would maybe have to do a little more work in that situation. But if I was building this kind of wrapping menu layout, I would probably use Flexbox. So if we resize the browser, we can see those items just wrap really nicely onto the next line. We use it because we're using Flex Wrap. We're using justify content to center them. We don't have to do a whole lot of work. That just works pretty well with Flexbox. But if we had this kind of header, So we've got like a logo on the left, we've got a kind of user shopping cart area on the right, and then we have a centered nav. So perhaps it looks like a clear case for flexbox. It just has a single dimension. We just want to space items out like along, one single line. But actually, if we use flexbox and we use justify content with space between, we're going to get like even spaces between the items, but the nav that's meant to be in the center is going to sit off to the left a little bit. So that's not, really what we want. And that's because both the content on either side isn't equal. But with using grid, we can actually center that nav really nicely because we can use FR tracks for the two outer columns, and we can just use auto for the inner column. So that's a nice little case for using grid. But then I probably want to use flexbox for the items inside here. So for that nav and for the user area on the right. So flexbox is pretty handy for those. But on the other hand, if I was building this kind of layout, I would almost definitely opt for grid. So it has 2 dimensions, it has overlapping items. It's much more of a prescriptive or art-directed layout. Each grid item needs to be positioned rather than letting content just flow into the grid organically. And we can see our grid tracks if we inspect it in Firefox, or I think like basically every browser has a grid inspector now, which is super handy. And as long as we use flexible grid tracks, then our layout is still going to adapt to the content. So we can have a much longer title. We could have changed the length of the block quote or the paragraph. Because we're using, flexible row heights, those row tracks are just going to grow. And, we could build this in other ways. But the really nice thing with grid is like if we want to build different variants of this component, it's super easy because we can just move things around on the grid a little bit more. We can have a different variant of this component, and we could have, maybe several variants on a page. And that's all done nicely with grid, rather than having to, position items and do like negative margins to overlap things and then kind of remeasure for these different variants. Grid is great for this stuff. And here's another example of the kind of UI challenge that grid is great for solving. So we have some components where some elements need to align to a central wrapper. So we've got the headings and the paragraphs which need to align with each other. And then as we scroll down, some of the images as well. So that's quite a common UI pattern. We have this kind of central wrapper. And then we have some other elements that need to break out of that and lead to the edge of the viewport, like the images at the top. Now we can use grid with a mixture of flexible and max width constrained column tracks to allow that. So I call this a concertina grid. So these 2 outer columns on either side are flexible. So they're using the FR unit. So they'll shrink or expand to the edge of the viewport while the others stay fixed up to the max width that we're defining. This layout wouldn't really work that well in flexbox. I mean, maybe you could kind of hack around and build it. You probably have to use calc. Grid, these are two-dimensional components. Grid handles that super nicely. And if we resize the browser, we can see how those outer column tracks start collapsing first, right down to nothing, and then the inner columns start collapsing. So works pretty nicely. Now, since grid, there have been a few more CSS features that work in harmony with our flex and grid layouts. Rachel mentioned aspect ratio yesterday, and I love the aspect ratio property because with a single line of CSS, it just eliminates the need for a whole lot of hacky code. So on the left was basically the simplest way to set an aspect ratio on an element prior to 2021. And we used to call this the padding hack for obvious reasons. You have some bottom padding on a pseudo element and you absolute position a child element. So you needed like an extra wrapper element as well. But now in 2022, all we need is this one beautiful line of CSS on the right, and all of this goes away. And it works great with our flex and grid layouts, especially if we combine it with object fit when working with images. So each of the items in this grid has an aspect ratio of 1, making it a square. And by the way, we can use the previous syntax with the two numbers separated by a slash, or we can use a decimal. Both are valid. So an aspect ratio of 1.5 would be equivalent to 3/2. Then we can set object fit to cover on the images so that whatever the dimensions of our original image, they're going to cover our square items nicely. So this works great for an image gallery or something like that. Or if we have something like a logo grid, we could set object fit to contain, and the logos will be nicely centered within our square items without any cropping. Now, if the browser doesn't support aspect ratio, all that will happen is each grid row will be auto-sized to the tallest item, or the tallest image here, which I think isn't a bad outcome. Like, the content is perfectly usable, despite not being exactly as designed. So, yay, progressive enhancement. Here's some word art for you. But if you really want to provide an alternative for older browsers, you can use a feature query like this. So maybe you want to set a max height or something to prevent those tracks getting super tall in case you had a really long vertical image. What you probably shouldn't do is use a feature query combined with the padding hack for browsers that don't support aspect ratio, because you're basically quadrupling the amount of code you have to write. And that is definitely not progressive enhancement. Now, the great thing about aspect ratio is it acts like a minimum or suggested aspect ratio. It's not, completely fixed. So if we have this card layout, which we could build with flex or grids, it doesn't really matter what we're building it with here, we can set the aspect ratio of the image on the left. So this one is set to 3:2. So it will always be at least that height relative to its width. But if the text content on the right is longer, then that image is just going to grow too. And that's because, when we're using flex or grid, the default value for align items is stretch. So that image column will grow it'll grow to the height of the longest column. Now, if this wasn't the behavior we wanted, then we could set align self to start or end or center, whichever we want on that image, and it would align differently. But I think this works great as a default for a component like this. And it's also possible to set an aspect ratio on an entire grid. So each of these 4 grids has an aspect ratio of 3:2. So that's set on the grid, not on the items inside the grid. And that means because we're using FR tracks for our rows and columns, we don't have to worry about our setting an aspect ratio on each of the individual items. They're just going to fill the space. So that works really nicely for kind of like a gallery layout. But if we had a grid of images or cards or something like that, then what should we use? Grid or flexbox? Now, there's no right or wrong answer here, but can I have a show of hands? Who would use flexbox to build a layout like this? And who would use grid? Cool. Oh, that's kind of 50-50, which is not what I was expecting, really. Now, it partly comes down to how we want the items to behave. So with flexbox, we can make individual items expand to fill the space, like on that last row where you have fewer than 3 items. We can say, actually, if we don't have enough items to fill the space, just, expand those items. So that's kind of nice with flexbox. That's pretty easy to do. Or we could justify them centrally. So, we set the flex grow back to 0, and we could use justify content. And now we have quite a nice responsive grid without any media queries. The items will just kind of fill the space. And the other thing here is the gap between the items. So building this in Flexbox used to be a little bit more complex, or at least less intuitive, because you'd have to set margins on the individual items. You'd have to set negative margins on the Flex container. But now we have gap in Flexbox. So, that just helps us that little bit more. But on the other hand, if I just want my content to just flow into the next available grid cell, then I'm probably going to use grid for that. That's just kind of my preference. I feel like this is a grid, I should use grid. That just feels like more intrinsic to me. But at the end of the day, it doesn't really matter which one you use. They're both capable of doing the job. The thing to remember with grid is you're building outside in. You're determining the rules on the grid container, and the items just fall into line. Whereas with flexbox, you're building inside out. So you're telling the items how much stretchiness and squishiness they should have. And then that influences our grid accordingly. And we can actually justify our items a little bit differently with grids, with a little bit of imagination and some quantity queries. So if we make our grid 6 columns wide and make each item span 2 columns, then we could say, if we have one item, make that last item span the whole row. Or if we have just 2 items, then just move them 1 column along. So we can do that kind of layout with grid 2. But, it's not responsive on its own. We would need to start writing some media queries once we get down to like kind of certain breakpoints, because we're not always going to have, or not always going to want to have like 2 items on their own. We're going to want those items to like wrap, at smaller sizes. There's nothing wrong with media queries, but on the modern web, we're increasingly building in components. We don't always know the context in which they're going to be used. And wouldn't it be great to just drop this grid in anywhere on our page and know that it will behave in a sensible way? Well, if we're doing this kind of basic grid layout where the content just flows into the next available grid cell, then one way we could do that is using auto-fit or auto-fill. So instead of specifying the number of tracks in our grid template columns property, we can say to our grid, use as many as will fill the space, or as will fit in the space. And then we use grid's min-max function. We're saying that our tracks should be at least 90, or our grid cells should be at least 19 rems, and up to 1 FR unit. So then they'll take up the available space. Now, this works, but if our viewport or if the available space is less than 19 rems, then we'll get overflow, because our column tracks have to be at least 19 rems. So instead, we could use CSS's min function, which picks the lesser of 2 values. So we're saying either pick 19 rems or 100%. And now our grid column tracks won't ever be wider than the available space. Lovely. Oh yeah, and we set 1 FR as the maximum in our min-max function. And alternatively, we could replace autofill with autofit with autofill. So the main difference here is when you have a single row of items, we have those items left over. When you have autofit, those items will expand to fill the space. With autofill, it's like autofit space, autofill, they're going to be filling up the container. So what's not to love about that? I think quite a lot, actually. So as much as I love these CSS functions, I don't think this is a particularly intuitive way to build, what should be a pretty simple grid. If I'm working in a shared code base, say, I don't want my simple grid code to look like a complex mathematical formula that somebody has to decode. It's very hard to see at a glance what exactly is going on here. And the other problem is we don't have that much control over the grid. So, we're always going to have as many columns as will fit in the space, but perhaps we want to go from, a 2-column layout to a 4-column layout, because we're always going to have, an even number of items, and that would just look nicer. Well, we can't do that with this. So how can we improve on this? One way in the not too distant future is with container queries. So what problem do container queries solve? So let's say we have our 3-column grid component and we want to put it into a narrower space, like a sidebar, obviously a much narrower space. We clearly don't want our grid to still have 3 columns, but we want it to stack like on mobile, but a media query based on viewport size is not going to detect that our grid is now in a very narrow container. So far better if we can query the width of the parent element or the container. And that's where container queries help us. So let's see how we can create this grid with container queries. So first, we need to define our container. So we need to specify a container type, and we can give it a name. So the name is optional, but it helps us in cases where we might have nested containers, and we need to specify which container an item should respond to. The type is inline size, which, if you're familiar with logical properties, you might recall refers to the width when the document is in the left to right or right to left writing mode. There's a lot more we could talk about with logical properties, but for the purpose of understanding container queries, all you need to be concerned with here is that this container allows us to query the width as things currently stand. And in this case, we're setting the container on both main and the aside element, and we're calling our container layout. That's the name we're giving it. So next, we're going to give our grid element a display property of grid, and we'll set a gap using a custom property. So this is the initial layout of our grid before we do any container queries. And this is how it will look at the smallest sizes, just a single column of stacked items with a gap between them. And then we can add our container queries. So we use @container, so similar to writing a media query. And then we use our container's name, so the layout container, and we're saying when the inline size is greater than 25 ems, give us a 2-column layout. And note here the new media query syntax. So instead of saying max width or min width, we're using the is greater than symbol. And that's because it's more consistent with logical properties, where you could be referring to the width or the height depending on the writing mode of the document. So what we're saying here is if the layout container is greater than 25 ems, give us a 2-column layout. If it's greater than 65 ems, give us a 4-column layout. So we can skip that 3-column step if we just decide we want to go from 2 columns to 4 columns. And using container queries means that we can also, if we have other properties that depend on the layout, we can adjust those within our container query as well. So we have a lot more control here. So now let's see it in action. So both the main elements, so that's the light blue area on the left, and the aside, so the dark area on the right, contain a grid which houses our grid items, but the layout of each grid is responding to its container, not the viewport. So any items in the sidebar are pretty much always going to be stacked vertically. Sorry, there's just one item in there at the moment. You'll see if we go down to sort of mid-sized tablet breakpoint, that element drops below, and it very briefly goes to that 2-column layout. And in fact, I'm combining media queries with container queries here too. I'm adding a border and padding to each of our grids when the viewport gets above a certain size, because I don't want to be in a situation where one of our grids has that and not the other one, because I want them to align nicely. So actually, it's perfectly fine to combine media queries and container queries. You don't have to throw out all of your media queries just yet. And we could also use container queries at a component level too. So we might have this card component that needs to be stacked when it's in a narrower space, but have a horizontal layout when it's in a larger space. And we can even nest them. So not only does our grid layout change, but the layout of our grid items or the actual card components does as well. So here we have 2 containers. We have the layout container on the main and on the aside element. So our grid changes from a 2-column grid when it's at large sizes, like on the left, and a single column becomes a single column when it goes down to smaller sizes. And the other container is each grid child itself. We're going to call this component. That's just the name that we're giving this one. So you do need kind of an extra elements for those card components to respond to. So you need like a wrapper, which will be the container inside each grid child. So as we resize, we can see, so when we have a component that spans 2 grid columns, we get that horizontal layout. But when it just spans a single column, we get this vertical layout. Now, you might also notice, you probably haven't noticed because you're watching other stuff, but that we're also scaling the size of the grid gap with the viewport as well. Now, we can actually see that a little bit clearer in this grid here. We don't need container queries for that. We can do it with some of the functions that we already have in CSS. So this is using the max function. I'm saying that the browser should use whichever is larger, 1 rem or 2 viewport width units. So min, we've already seen, does a similar thing, but it picks the smaller of the 2 values. And clamp takes 3 values, and it will pick the middle one, which is super useful for doing fluid typography. But another place it's really useful is for controlling the layout and vertical rhythm across our whole site. So we could set some custom properties at the root level and use them everywhere. So I'm setting this variable that I'm calling pad, short for padding, which is a bit misleading because I'm going to use it for things that are not padding. But you get the idea. And then we can create like subdivisions of this variable. So I'm using clamp for the original padding variable, and then I'm doing, padding small or pad large or whatever, just using calc for those. So they'll be based off of the original variable, which uses clamp. And I love how fluid this can make our layouts. So, for instance, we could set a top margin on any element that follows another one within this wrapper element using, this is uses the lobotomized owl selector, which you might have heard of, popularized by Hayden Pickering. But if we're using logical properties, we could change that to margin block start. So using logical properties isn't something that I really I'm not in the habit of using just yet, but I'm trying to introduce that more into my CSS because I think they're going to be a lot more relevant. So it's probably a good idea to start using them where possible. And then we could override that for certain elements if we choose to. Like here, maybe we want a narrower space following our headings. So we can use another padding variable. So I'm using a smaller padding variable, which is calculated from our original fluid size. So it will still scale. So at large viewport sizes, this value will resolve to 3 rems. At mobile sizes, it will be 1 rem and no less. And then at sort of medium tablet sizes, that's where we will get that scaling, because it will be based on the viewport. And we can visualize it with a graph. So we start off at one rem, and then we have a period in the middle where it scales fluidly. But when it hits 3 rems, it will just level out, and it won't grow any larger. Now, the website Utopia actually creates this scaling system for you. So you just give it the minimum and maximum viewport sizes and some multipliers, and it gives you back a whole load of custom properties based on fluid sizing with clamp, just ready to drop right into your CSS and use for your spacing and your font sizes. So it's super handy. And the beauty of this is it allows you to say, I want this to start and stop scaling at these specific viewport sizes. So, it can make things a lot more consistent. So instead of worrying about tweaking padding on like a bunch of elements all over the place at different breakpoints, then setting a few simple rules and letting the browser just do its thing ensures that our layouts are robust at all different sizes. And it drastically reduces the amount of code we have to write. And with the web as fluid as it is today, and all the different devices our users could be using, it just doesn't make sense to be just tweaking here and there when you could have a system instead. Now, we're a little bit limited in what it's actually practical to scale with clamp. So we don't really want to scale the font size of the item in the sidebar in the same way that we scale the large horizontal item on the left. And, perhaps we also want to scale like the padding of the card or something like that. We can't do that with viewport units here because these, the size and layout of these items doesn't depend on the viewport, it's depending on its container. But hold it right there because we will soon have container relative units to add to the mix. And these work a lot like viewport units, but relative to the container. So we have CQW and CQH, query container width and query container height, which are a lot like V8, VW and VH, the viewport width and viewport height, but they are relative to the container. Then CQI and CQB are their logical property equivalents for inline size and block size. And then CQmin, CQmax are a lot like Vmin and Vmax, so they'll take the smallest and the largest, respectively, of the two measurements. So instead of manually setting the font size for our cards like some kind of loser, we could maybe do some use clamp and use our new container units to make that font size scale as well. So here instead of doing a viewport size for our viewport units for our middle value in clamp, we're going to use 5 CQI, so query container inline size, plus 1 rem. Now, the plus 1 rem is because we want to ensure that users are still able to increase the font size using the browser's native zoom controls. So it helps us make our layouts or make those size fonts more accessible to our users. Now, unfortunately, I can't show you a demo of this in action because so even though container units work in Chrome with the flag enabled, Chrome, this might have changed. I'm sure somebody will tell me I'm wrong in a minute. Chrome seems not to support the latest container query syntax. Perhaps they just don't have an update. I don't know. So my container queries demos were not working. Container units was working, but because I didn't have the container queries working, it actually wasn't working. So yeah, I can't actually show you that. This stuff is all sort of super new and experimental, and it's changing, almost daily. So the only place that I am currently able to use container queries is Safari Tech Preview. Again, that's quite possible. It will have changed like in the last few days because these things are changing all the time. So the best thing to do really is check the interop dashboard. And also, just try it on a bunch of browsers. Probably works in some of them. Now, we've talked a lot about grid layouts. Next, I want to talk about subgrid, which is part of the level 2 grid specification. And Firefox has had this for like 2 years or more. And we've been waiting all this time for the other browsers to catch up. But now, all the other browsers are getting on board and catching up, which is super exciting. So let's look at what it will help us achieve with our layouts. So subgrid allows any of a grid's children to inherit the parent grid. So a simple example is if we have 2 cards side by side like this, they have different content in the top, in the middle, and the bottom, but we want those cards each of those sections in those cards to align with each other. Now, without subgrid, neither card is aware of the other one's content. So how are we going to do that? But now that we have subgrid, we could make each card span 3 grid rows. And then we can use subgrid so that they inherit the parent's grid. So we're using it in the grid template rows property. We're giving it a value of subgrid. And now our items inside the cards will just magically align because they're all on the same grid. Another cool thing is we can override the gap value in subgrid as well. So, our original grid had a gap because perhaps if we had more items above and below it, we probably want to maintain a gap between those items. But inside the cards, we actually, maybe don't need the gap at all. So we're overriding it, giving it a gap value of 0. Cool. Again, if a browser doesn't support subgrid, all that's going to happen is that our grid items aren't going to look quite as harmonious. I mean, it's not really a problem. Our users can still understand the content perfectly well. It just, doesn't look quite as nice. So yay, once again, progressive enhancement is the winner here. But there'll probably be some situations where this might not work, quite as well as this, and you need to provide a fallback. Again, you can do this with a feature query. So that's kind of the most common or obvious use case, but there are plenty of other cases where subgrid might be useful too. So in this grid component, we want the fig caption to align with the heading. Now, here's how the grid looks if we inspect it. So Firefox allows you to inspect grids and their subgrids. I think maybe Chrome does now too, maybe? Yay, cool. But the problem is the fig caption is a child of the figure. And we want to align it to the same grid as its parent and to be aware of the other grid items so that if the text on the right gets much longer, it's not just going to collide with the caption. So we can set a subgrid on the figure, and this time we're going to use the row and the column axis. And then we can position the image and caption on the subgrid because they're direct children of that figure. And this way, if the text content is longer, our grid track is just going to grow accordingly. The text isn't going to crash into the caption. Everyone will be happy. Now, another thing I'm pretty excited about is the has pseudo-class or parent selector. So this can help us with a bunch of different issues. It's not exclusive to CSS layout, but that said, let's take a look at some of the possibilities for CSS layout. So we could show a different layout for a component depending on whether a particular element is present or not. So we might have this grid component which has a block quote, and we want to center the text like this. But if that quote has an accompanying image, we want to do a slightly different grid layout, and we're going to left align the text. So we can do that using has. We're just saying, does this grid have an image? Cool. Do this different grid layout instead. Or we can use quantity queries to display a completely different grid layout depending on the number of items present in our grid. So I have this grid. I'm setting an aspect ratio on the whole grid itself. So it's always going to be a square. And we're going to see how we can pack any number of items into this grid in different ways. We're going to use has for this. So we'll start off with a 3-column grid. And we're going to set the number of columns as a variable. It's just going to make our code a bit more concise. And as our items flow into the grid, they're going to create new row tracks or implicit tracks. So let's make sure that any new rows take up an equal proportion of the available space by setting the grid auto rows property to 1FR. Now, as things stand, if we have 4 items in our grid, they'll create a new implicit track, but that last item is going to sit awkwardly on its own and just look kind of gross. So for any grid that has an even number of items, we can give it 2 columns instead of 3. So we're using what's known as a quantity query here within the has pseudo class. We're saying if the last child has an even number as its index, then make this grid 2 columns. So how about if we have 5 items? Because that's not going to balance nicely, whichever way you look at it. So we could turn this back into a 2-column grid, and then we could make that first item span both columns. And we could keep going. So, we just need to handle any grid that has a prime number of items so that it results in a nicely packed layout. So that might be kind of cool for some sort of, gallery component, perhaps. Now, we've only touched on some of the new CSS layout features today. There are plenty more cool features in CSS that help make building creative layouts easier than ever before. And I hope you're all as excited as I am by this new era of CSS layout and can start to see the creative possibilities. And a really big thank you to Rachel, Andrew, Jen Simmons, Miriam, Suzanne in particular for really pushing this stuff forward and leading the way on it. Now, if there's one thing I'd like you to take away from this talk is that the web is fluid and not fixed. So we can't know exactly how users are going to perceive the amazing layouts we're building, the type of devices they're using, and their browsing conditions. But we have more tools in our CSS layout toolbox than ever before. And that means we can challenge ourselves to build more creative layouts that are still resilient and in a way that's intrinsic to the web. We should accept and embrace the fact that users have choices. And that unknowability, that diversity, is the web's strength, not its limitation. And that seems like as good a place as any to end. So thanks for listening, and look forward to your questions.
That was amazing. I'm going to invite you to have a seat here so we can continue the conversation.
Just made it. Oh, thank you.
So we've got some questions from the audience, and one of them I have opinions about, and I would love to hear yours, is do you nowadays still sometimes use CSS floats for layout and positioning? And if yes, in what situation?
So the only times I use floats now are for the thing that floats were designed for, which is when you have like a block of text, you want to put an image in amongst that text, and the text just wraps around the image. I have very few situations where a design calls for that now, but yeah, that's basically it. And there's also, well, it's related, but also like CSS shapes. You kind of have to use floats for that. I wish you didn't. I wish there was better ways to do that, because I'd like to be able to wrap text around a thing in different ways without, but still kind of determine that that's going to be this height, that's going to be that height. But yeah.
I'm looking at Mr. Argyle in the first row. Yes, I actually have the same opinion as you. So glad to know that we're on the same page. There was also one thing Tim mentioned is you talked about grid, we talked about subgrid. There's a little feature in those specs that you did not mention today. What about masonry?
Yes. So I've heard Rachel talk about this a while ago. I haven't kind of looked it up recently because it seems to have kind of gone quite quiet on that front. I know people are thinking about it or have been thinking about it. But I actually don't know what the current status is, whether actually any movement has been made on the implementation. It's interesting because I feel like when this was talked about maybe 2 or 3 years ago, I was seeing a lot of masonry style layouts built, and I was being asked to build a lot of those layouts, and we used libraries for that, like JS libraries. But these days, I'm not seeing that many designs that call for it. And I think it was maybe a bit of a kind of design fashion thing, one of those design trends that's maybe a little bit fallen out of favor. I could be wrong about that, but I haven't needed it for a while. I would love to get that on the web in CSS. And I like the interesting thing about it is it's not really a flexbox thing or a grid thing. It's kind of a both and neither thing.
It's its own thing, isn't it?
Yeah. So I can see why it's, potentially very difficult to define and difficult to implement. But I'd love to chat to some people on the browser teams about whether we're getting that soon or not.
So slightly related to that, this is my own selfish personal question. So designers, you mentioned that you're not getting that many masonry designs. So the designs originate from designers for the most part. So how do you think with all these new CSS features, especially in these recent years, do you have suggestions on how to communicate with these designers? It's like, you don't have to do those things that you used to do because they're new things that you as a creative person could design in that way. Like, how does this communication work? Because I think that is a bit of a challenge a lot of the times.
I think it's the biggest challenge, honestly. I think like it's amazing to see how far CSS is moving. I really feel like design thinking needs to do some catching up, if I'm quite honest. I'm not sure how much of this stuff is being talked about in design circles, or whether designers are starting to think in this way. Like certainly like as a kind of designy developer, like it's on my radar, but like most designers I've worked with aren't coders. I have talked to a few designers recently that use Webflow, and I'm quite interested in that. Like, so designers who, you know, have some familiarity of the code, even though they're not, you know, really kind of writing it, but they sort of know about the code that is produced by these tools. And I'm wondering whether that kind of approach to design has more like of a role to play in like demonstrating like what's possible on the web. But yeah, like I get that, like when I was talking about, you know, we can build these fluid layouts, we can just use these variables, everything is harmonious. And then a designer comes along and says, yes, but at this size, I think this should be 4 pixels to the left. Like, but no, that's not how it works. Don't mess with the system. So I get the frustration of that. I don't have a definite answer, and I would love to hear how we can make that kind of joined up thinking more kind of harmonious across.
Yeah, a lot of food for thought, but give it up again for Michelle Barker.
Thank you.